do not, under any circumstances whatsoever, use 220 minus your age to get your max heart rate. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of that stuff, endurance sports. So if that's something that you're into, well, go on down there. Buttons, things, jazz. You know what you're doing. I don't need to explain this to you. This is YouTube. Although it can be very satisfying to click buttons and things and jazz. These are fun. I'll stop. But today's video, no surprise. Big red letters behind me, and the fact that, well, you clicked on the video, right? We are talking about heart rate. And in my experience as an endurance athlete, there has been no shortage of questions regarding heart rate out there. I have fielded a number of these questions out in the ether that is the interweb. I have had a number of these questions on my channel, and quite a few of them came from my most recent video, the Workouts 101 video. Now, if you are newer to training or training with structure, I highly recommend checking out that video if you want to learn more about FTP and power zones and all of that stuff that you see in these indoor cycling platforms. I go through a pretty comprehensive baseline knowledge video talking about all these things and give you a lot of the details that you're going to need. I understand that it is a longer video. I did put chapters into it so that if you have limited amount of time, you can always come back and pick up where you left off. But it just was more sensible to put it all in one video rather than letting the YouTube algorithm kind of serve it up to people out of sequence and make it extremely confusing. So if you're interested in that video, I will link it down below and in the end screen. On that note, this video probably will be a little bit longer as well. I'm covering a lot of detail in these videos, things that have taken myself and several athletes, probably the majority of athletes, several years to really pick up on and learn. You don't know what you don't know until you're exposed to it. And then when you're exposed to it, you got to kind of go research and you go down the rabbit hole, because a lot of these resources are written or discussed in nomenclature that is very industry specific, a lot of jargon, and it's really tough to navigate and can be really overwhelming for beginning athletes. So the purpose of these videos is to make this stuff a lot more digestible and a lot more understandable so that you can kind of set yourself a framework and baseline knowledge, because that's how we learn. We familiarize ourselves with certain terms and concepts, and we continue to build on our knowledge by adding new information and attaching it to old information. So that's the purpose of these videos. I understand they're lengthy, and I do respect the fact that a lot of you are busy out there, but hopefully if you can take the time to watch these, you will get a lot of good information, things that, you know, we wasted a lot of time not being able to use in the beginning and grinding our gears, no pun intended, doing things that didn't really serve us from a training perspective. Hopefully you guys can avoid the same pitfalls if you are newer. Now, as people are new to cycling or endurance sport in general, they have this hyperfixation on heart rate, right? That's the most common question I see out there, actually. How do I train with heart rate? How do I get my heart rate zones? Because they have this idea ingrained in their head that heart rate is the paramount primary metric that we should be using for sport. And understandably so. For a lot of sports and for a number of years, heart rate was the only metric that we had to measure us, right? We had telemetry data, we could get speed and distance and elevation and all of that stuff, but that really wasn't a very good metric of what our body was doing physiologically. So we were limited to heart rate, and a lot of sports are still limited to heart rate. So we have this kind of preponderance of heart rate data, and we really want to make that fit so that we can accurately judge our efforts. But the reality is heart rate is really not a very good primary metric. Now, don't confuse what I'm saying here. I'm not saying heart rate is unimportant. It's very important and it's very valuable. It can give you a lot of insight and information about your training and how your body is responding. But it is not something that you want to be fixated on as a measure of your instantaneous effort. I like to analogize it to using a speedometer on your car, right? You're driving around, you know, the speedometer is not something that you're glued to. It's something that you're using as a sense check or governor. And depending on what you're doing, you may need to glance at that speedometer to see if you're in the speed limit, right? Maybe you're changing to a school zone, or you're accelerating into a throughway area, or you're getting off of an exit, or you see a cop on the side of the road, right? We want to get a quick glance at our speedometer and see how our car is responding to the work being done by the fuel combustion engine or the electric motor in our vehicle. The engine is what's doing the work. The engine is giving you the output, but that could be variable. The car's speed could change for the same amount of work being done by the engine. It's going to vary based on terrain, based on road conditions, based on wind. All of these things can impact how fast the vehicle's going in response to the work that is going into the vehicle. We want to use heart rate in the same way. We want to get a sense check or a judgment of how the body is reacting to the work that we are putting out. The other thing that makes heart rate so prevalent in our minds is this idea of wearables, right? Almost everybody has a wearable in some regard or another these days, it seems, whether it's a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a Garmin watch or Wahoo or Samsung watch. All of these things now having optical heart rates built into them. Some of the phones have optical heart rates built right into the cameras. And there's this oversubscription to this idea of using heart rate for everything because it is the only metric that we have. And we've used heart rate as a proxy for some of our output data to try to get a good estimate on calorie burns and efforts, right? It's something that we use and we can get a decent approximation for, but it's really not that precise. Now, I did an entire video a few months ago about calories and why heart rate is really not a good measure of how many calories you're burning. I'm not going to repeat that all here for those people who've already watched that video. I'll link that down below and at the end screen as well. It's probably a good video to follow this one, but short version or Cliff's Notes version is that, you know, heart rate is using kind of some statistical averages based on output and other athletes, and it's trying to kind of guess how many calories you're burning or how much activity you're doing based on that number. And those numbers are usually about 85% maximum accurate. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. And again, the rest of this video will kind of put that more into context for you, why realistically heart rate is not a very good metric to use for calories either. The proof in the pudding on this is moving into metrics like power. Cycling in particular, having a fixed piece of equipment that you can actually put a power meter on, was the first sport to make power available because they realized that heart rate's just not very good. It's not measuring your instantaneous effort. It's not giving you an accurate appraisal of the effort that you're putting in. So we can put these hard connections onto our bikes and get a more exact measurement of what our output actually is. And you're starting to see that in running as well. Power meters being made. The limitation being you don't have a fixed piece of equipment, so now they're relying on accelerometers and AI to kind of figure out what your power output is. And as they kind of dial this in with more data points available, you're going to see that power meters for running are going to start to supplant heart rate based training because it is going to be more accurate. We are measuring watts, we are measuring output, actual joules. That is an actual measurement of power and output and what's coming from your muscles. Heart rate is really not doing that. And this video is really going to show you why heart rate falls apart very quickly when you really want to try to use it as a primary metric. So if I'm going to break the paradigm of training with heart rate and tell you what a kind of piss poor primary metric it is, well, why is that the case? Well, the first thing is the number of factors that can affect your heart rate. There are a lot of things that can happen that will artificially suppress or increase your heart rate. And by artificially, I don't mean that it's not physiologically happening, because it is, but artificially in that it's not related to your effort in the moment. If you're doing a workout, your heart rate can be artificially increased by one of these factors here that has nothing to do with the workout or how hard you're working. Things like recovery, fatigue, lack of sleep, illness, stress, those can artificially affect your heart rate and give you a completely inaccurate read on the screen of what your heart's doing versus how much effort you're actually putting into the workout. Things like bike position. Believe it or not, different muscular engagement can change your heart rate. So being in the aero position versus the upright position can yield two different heart rates for you, even at the same amount of power. We've got things on here like race nerves, right? If you've ever towed the line for a race, it doesn't even have to be a cycling race. When you were a kid in school and you were in gym class and you were doing a race, you probably remember your heart rate starting to kind of flutter a little bit. The adrenaline starting to rush, you really want to win, you're getting a little bit nervous. That can artificially inflate your heart rate. Nutrition, caffeine, things that you're putting in your body, those can all affect heart rate as well. These factors could potentially affect your performance, and some of them don't. Some of them just artificially increase your heart rate or decrease your heart rate, and they have nothing to do with your ability to execute and perform. There are a number of different factors, including those that I haven't listed here, that can really throw off that number and give you a very inaccurate perception of how hard you're working if you're relying on that number to tell you about your effort. But those things can be very inconsistent. What is consistent is how that data tracks against your output. So here's an example here of some VO2 max level efforts, like 4 or 5 minutes apiece. And what you'll see is that when you're training with power, you see this immediate increase and this immediate tracking of your output, right? You have a very precise measurement of what's going on, how much your muscles are doing in terms of work. But if you take a look at the heart rate graph attached to it, you can see that it's a lagging indicator. And what that means is that it takes your heart rate some time to catch up with the output, right? If you look at these intervals, it takes past the midpoint of the intervals for the heart rate to even start to level off and reach that peak level. You know this to be true if you got up right now and you did a gut-busting sprint as far as you could go. For the first 10, 15 or so seconds, you probably won't have any impact on your breathing or your heart rate. You're going to be doing that basically just on neuromuscular level power. But as you continue the effort, you're going to start to feel that your heart rate starts to rise, your breathing starts to change, and that's because it's a lagging indicator. It takes a few seconds or more for the muscles to start demanding that increased oxygen consumption and blood flow that's going to come from the heart. So if you were just going to look at this graph and take the power out of there and measure your effort based on your heart rate, you're going to undercut yourself in terms of how hard you were working. So it's not really a very good measure of your effort. You can see that right here. Look at how hard this person is working for these top intervals. It's actually looking like they were going to be increasing their effort over time when that's not actually the case. The next phenomenon that can throw off heart rate and its readability is this idea of cardiac drift. This is also referred to as aerobic decoupling. And what that is over time at the same pace or effort, your heart rate will continue to increase to a certain point. Or you may see this as a constant heart rate and then the pace or effort will eventually have to decrease. And what's happening here is over time, your muscle fibers are going to fatigue. And when they fatigue, they're going to call on new, fresh, unused muscle fibers for help. So that engages more muscle fibers at a time. And in order to use more muscle fibers, you need more oxygen. To get more oxygen to those muscle fibers, you need greater blood flow. To get greater blood flow, you need to increase your heart rate. So what happens is as you recruit more and more muscle fibers, you're going to see the heart rate go up, even if your pace is remaining the same. What you may also see is if you are doing structured workouts and you are doing a bunch of intervals, let's say you are doing a bunch of 5-minute threshold level intervals, what you'll find is later on in the workout, your heart rate for the on interval is going to get a little bit higher, and then your recovery valley heart rate may also be higher. So you'll see that stair step up. Now the good news here is that this is very trainable. This is why zone 2 riding is so important, because that helps you to build those fatigue resistant, slow twitch muscle fibers. And the more you are diligent in that type of training, the longer it's going to take for those muscles to fatigue. So you'll be able to A, reduce the delta between that max heart rate and that starting baseline heart rate, and 2, you can take that period of time and you can protract it out longer. So if you are new to riding, you might find that a zone 2 ride for an hour, you're going to start to see your heart rate continue to drift upwards. And as you become more and more fit and more trained, you're going to start to see it take longer. It might take 90 minutes, it might take 2 hours. And the more stress and load and consistency you are putting into your body, the less drastic this cardiac drift or this aerobic decoupling is going to become. Now this is a good point to draw the distinction between two major elements of training, and that is FTP and fitness. A lot of people, especially if you're coming in from just the Zwift side of the business, have a very high reliance on this idea of FTP and think that FTP is the only measure of their capacity or their ability as an athlete. But the reality is that's only half of the equation. The other half is your fitness. Now there's a bunch of performance management charts out there on Strava and Training Peaks and Today's Plan that kind of measure that and graph that out for you. That's outside of the scope of this video. But basically fitness is measuring the amount of consistent load that you are putting into the system and your ability to take load in the future. So the more riding and more training that you do, the more apt you are able to take on more load, to take on more power. And your heart rate in conjunction with that can tell you how your fitness is tracking. You know, ideally you want to see your heart rate to become lower at the same level of output or power, or to be able to do a higher level of power at the same heart rate. So that's where you can kind of put these metrics together and start to get a good picture of how your body is adapting to the training. Do you need to be adding more load? Do you need to be training differently? Are you plateauing? It gives you a really good appraisal of what's going on there. Now, to give you an example of how fitness and FTP might not tell you the same things, let's say you have two twin brothers, brother A and brother B. They're both the exact same height and weight, and they have the same exact FTP. But the thing is, brother A does more periodized training. They do a lot of work in zone 2. They do their sweet spot blocks. They do several workouts in high intensity format. They do a couple of races here and there. They're very well rounded and consistent with their training. Whereas brother B is not all that consistent, but every time they get on the bike, they work really, really hard. They do high intensity interval sets, the hardest ones that they can find. They get into Zwift races and they basically burn themselves up until complete failure every single time. And over time, they're both able to build the same FTP. One of them has built it up more foundationally with that big wide base of the pyramid that I talked about in the workout video. And brother B has really been able to build it up, but it's a very narrow tower, kind of like Jenga blocks. And as soon as you start to kind of pull things out of the bottom, things fall apart very quickly. If you took brother A and brother B and put them out on a road race, brother A, failing any kind of tactics, is going to perform substantially better than brother B. And why is that? Because they have more fatigue-resistant muscle fibers built up. They've worked their other zones. They're able to recover at a higher percentage of their FTP. They have more repeatability. They're not just focused on being able to train a very high level of execution for a short period of time like brother B. Brother B might be able to nail a 20-minute effort at a high level of power, but that's all they got. Whereas brother A has a lot more durability and reliability in their power execution. So FTP and fitness need to work hand in hand, and being able to measure those together with heart rate will give you a very good appraisal at your actual capacity as an athlete. The 20-minute FTP test or the ramp test is not going to tell you everything. Power is very important, but it's not everything. That's where you're pulling fitness and heart rate into the fold. So then what's the point of heart rate zones? I've heard a lot about these heart rate zones, and they seem to match up with your power zones. So why do we do that if we can't use heart rate to replace power? Well, there's a good reason for these zones, and it's to look for parity. And again, to judge our fitness, we want to make sure that our heart rate and our power are kind of matched up in the particular zones in which we are working. So you can kind of see that there's a heart rate zone attached to each power zone here. And what happens is a lot of times when you're newer, you might be riding in a zone like your endurance zone, and you'll find that your heart rate is actually landing more in your tempo zone. And that's okay. But what you'll see that with training and consistency over time, that heart rate will start to reduce for that same level of effort, which I talked about in terms of fitness, and you'll see a better match in terms of the zone you are working in and the heart rate attached to that zone. That means you're putting less of a demand on your heart. That means your muscle fibers are more fatigue resistant, and you are improving in an athlete. And in some cases, you might see this kind of reverse disparity here, where you'll see that you're working at maybe your zone 3 tempo, but your heart rate remains in your zone 2. This is kind of the bread and butter for your long course triathletes. Many of them are optimizing for this state. They want to be able to work at their race pace in the zone 3 area, but they don't want to put a very high demand on their heart. So they want to be able to execute for a longer period of time at the zone 3 while remaining in zone 2, because they have to get off and they have to run. And that's a weight-bearing exercise, and that's going to put more demand on their heart. So they want to try to save their heart the best that they can. And if they can train themselves to be at that zone 3 but have the fitness to remain with a heart rate in zone 2, that can be very effective for you. And if you just kind of think about you're putting less beats in your heart, less stress on your heart, it's going to give you a lot more longevity. So I'll start with max heart rate, and that's because that's been a standard for a very long time. People have used max heart rate to make their heart rate zones for quite a long time. But there are some limitations here. First and foremost is eliciting that max heart rate number. It's actually quite difficult. It requires a very high level of effort and a very specialized set of circumstances to be able to actually reach that max heart rate to get that number. I will talk about testing protocols in the next slide. But most people are getting a max heart rate out of something like a race. And many people have not trained the ability to suffer to the extent that they have to reach that max heart rate. That's not a slight against anybody. It's just is what it is. It's very hard to reach your maximum heart rate. The other thing about max heart rate is it really does not adjust with the athlete. Your max heart rate is more or less a fixed or hard-coded number. That's something that's a part of you genetically. You have a genetic limit for your max heart rate, and training is not going to increase that. So if your max heart rate is 185 beats per minute, you're not going to train it up to 200 beats per minute. If that's what you see in your testing, it's because you just never tested to your maximum to begin with. But your max heart rate really is what it is. You may be able to tickle that up a beat or two per minute, but it really is what it is, and then with age we start to see that decline. Depending on your training, you can slow that down with some training. If you're a trained athlete, your max heart rate does not seem to decline as quickly as just kind of the average person out there, but max heart rate is really not a perfect system. You can see that some of these zones here, we've kind of just taken some very basic zone breakpoints of 10% each, right? You start at 50% in your zone 1, 50 to 60%, 60 to 70%, 70 to 80%. So it's really just kind of working on averages. I kind of equate this to getting your max level power or your sprint level power and trying to work backwards and build your training zones. You're probably going to run into some real issues when people start to defy averages or have a different profile. So that's where percentage of threshold heart rate comes into play. Threshold heart rate is basically an FTP for your heart. So now you're training at that kind of sliver around your lactate threshold and getting a baseline, and then you're taking a distribution around that number, higher and lower, and it's more built around you, and it can be a changing number. You know, when you are less fit as an athlete, what may happen is that you have a threshold heart rate that is a very low percentage of your max heart rate. So let's say, for example, your max heart rate is 200 beats per minute. But you do a zone 4 test and you find out that working at 20 minutes at your threshold level power, your heart rate is 160 beats per minute. That's probably your threshold heart rate, but that's only going to be 80% of your max heart rate. If you look at the max heart rate zones, that puts you in your zone 3 tempo. So you're going to actually, by using this max heart rate format, you're going to misread where your actual heart rate zone is. It's not going to put you in the right heart rate zone. So to be able to test your threshold level heart rate and then basically set that baseline, then that's going to put you in the appropriate zones. And as you get more fit, you retest over time. And if your threshold level heart rate goes up, then you can kind of readjust those zones as you go. And just so you know, if you're overwhelmed by this, this is not something that you have to figure out. The softwares will do this for you. Garmin, Wahoo, Strava. If you just feed it one of these two numbers, it's going to give you the heart rate zones. You can maybe print them out and put them on your stem or put them on your desk until you get to memorize them, kind of like memorizing your phone number or social security number. The more that you use it, the more they'll become second nature. But you'll be able to adjust these training zones around you as a person. Now, eventually you are going to hit kind of your genetic potential, and your threshold heart rate's really not going to go any higher, right? You can only go up to a certain percentage of your max heart rate before it's just going to stop. My threshold level heart rate for several years has been pretty much the same because I'm not going to make up any larger of a percentage of my max heart rate. So you're going to reach a potential at some point where you're going to set it and forget it. But in the beginning, expect that number to change a little bit. You should be testing your FTP every 4 to 6 weeks or after a training block so that you can make sure that your zones are set appropriately for your structured workouts. Same thing goes for your threshold level heart rate. You should be getting a sense check on this, you know, at the end of every training block, every 4 to 6 weeks, and that testing can go hand in hand with your power level testing. So on the subject of testing, how do we actually test for it? Well, there's a number of different protocols that you can use. You can search online, you'll find a number of different testing protocols, and a lot of them follow kind of the same format. So to test your max heart rate, you could do it in a race and look for your peak level power. It's not looking for any protracted period of time, it's literally looking for that almost instantaneous peak. But one of the ways that you might be able to test it without a race is to kind of do a ramp up into your high VO2 max and then finish things off with like a high level effort, a max sprint. You can do that on a hill. You can try to do that indoors. I've noticed that a lot of people have a hard time hitting their max heart rate indoors. I think it's because of the body English that you use outdoors. It just helps to elevate that heart rate a little bit more to give you a better read on your max. But that's a possibility for max heart rate. But for the preferred method, the lactate threshold heart rate, one example is to do a 30-minute time trial. So you do a time trial at your threshold level power, and then you kind of you hit the lap timer, you just kind of scrub over the last 20 minutes of the workout, and then you figure out what your average power is there. The last 20 minutes of the effort, not the workout, but you get your average power there. You can do the same thing in a 20-minute FTP test. You could take the second half of it and probably get a good appraisal of your lactate threshold heart rate. Some people can get a good appraisal from a ramp test and kind of slicing out the last minute or two. They might be able to get something close to their lactate threshold heart rate. Some, you know, your Garmin, your Wahoo, sometimes they're able to detect within a workout kind of what the preceding load is and be able to get you a good lactate threshold heart rate there as well. There's a number of ways to skin a cat, but if you could really dial in this lactate threshold heart rate number, it will more adequately and more accurately build zones that will match up better with your power zones, or at least give you an accurate appraisal as to whether or not you are matched up. But what I do want to highlight here, down underlined at the bottom of the page, do not, under any circumstances whatsoever, use 220 minus your age to get your max heart rate. Do not do it. It's garbage. It doesn't work. This 220 minus your age bullshit is built around statistical averages of the general population. It's not built around athletes. It does a horrible time of taking females that generally have a lower heart rate. Now, I know there's like a 214 minus your age as well. Either way, it's crap. It's really just kind of giving you maybe an average. Maybe you'll land there, maybe you won't, and maybe just accidentally you'll happen to land perfectly at 220 minus your age. But more often than not, in my own experience and my own observations, it's been wrong. It doesn't work. And in fact, the more that you train and the fitter that you are, the more you're going to defy this number. Masters athletes that have spent a number of years training tend to really just make that that formula there look like complete garbage, because that's what it is. Real athletes do not use 220 minus their age. And if you're watching this video and you're interested in learning about training and you throw your leg over the bike or you go out for a run, guess what? You're a real athlete. You should care about your training. You should care about the integrity of your numbers. And I just caution you against using that number, because it's going to be crap. It's complete garbage. But that's my diatribe for the day. Now, I can see some of you out there watching me on your phones or on your computers with your heart sitting somewhere in your stomach, defeated and deflated, because you're thinking to yourself, I don't have a power meter on my bike. I only have it on my smart trainer, or I'm using Z-Power with Zwift. And I'm here trying to learn how I can train with power because it's affordable and it's accessible, and I can't afford to put a power meter on my bike, or I don't know if I want to spend the money. And you're basically telling me that that idea is shot. Well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get better and track my training? Well, there's a way to train effectively. It's scientifically backed, and it's not going to cost you a dime. And that's training with perceived exertion. Now, this may sound hokey because we want to have metrics that track everything. We want to have that data attached to it, or it doesn't mean anything. But the reality is that training by rate of perceived exertion is extremely effective. Pros did this for a very long time and continue to do this. In fact, even if you're training with power, you should understand perceived exertion intimately, because there's going to be a time that your power meter fails, or you're out in a race and you can't look down, and you have to make a sense check and a judgment based on how you feel as to how much longer you can sustain an effort and how much power you're actually putting out. And the more you train and pay attention to your body and understand this, even if you are training with power, you'll get to a point where you're riding along and you know within about 10% how many watts you're putting out, because you are used to that perceived exertion. And it's very simple. We're putting our power output on a 1 to 10 scale, kind of a pain scale of our exertion level here. And those particular zones land predictably within perceived exertion zones. So we'll go through those so that you can kind of understand them. So zone 1, pretty obviously, is going to land at a 1 or 2 on the pain scale. Very easy, barely noticeable. You're almost using gravity to turn those legs over at that point. And that's your active recovery zone. When you get into zone 2, your endurance, it's going to be noticeable. You're going to have a little bit of tension there, but again, it's still going to be easy. Then as you get into your zone 3, your tempo zone, that moderate zone, you start to feel it's a little bit more brisk. It's a little bit more noticeable. You got to kind of pay attention to what's going on. It might be slightly uncomfortable, but you're still able to handle it. Now, I don't have it on here, your sweet spot or your zone 3 plus. That's going to be between your 6 and 7, bridging your zone 3 tempo and your zone 4 threshold. So it's going to have quite a bit of a pinch there. It's, again, sustainable, but a little bit more difficult. Then you have your zone 4 threshold that is going to land from a 7 or an 8. And if you look at the hospital smileys here, that's going to tell you between very intense and utterly horrible. That's very, always rely on the hospital smileys when it comes to your rate of perceived exertion. They'll never lead you wrong. If it's utterly horrible, you're probably in your threshold. And then your zone 5, which is going to be your low VO2 max, so that 105% to about 120% for most people, that's also going to land very firmly in the utterly horrible category. Then your zone 9, which is those short type of VO2 max efforts, which is going to be between about 30 seconds and 3 minutes. That's going to be straight 9, and that's going to put you at the excruciating or unbearable category. And then your neuromuscular level power, those sprint level efforts where you're completely taking everything that you have in the muscles, that's going to be a solid 10, and that's going to be unimaginable or unspeakable. And you got the sad crying face over here, and it's pretty awful. But the hospital smileys, they really have you covered when it comes to RPE. Although the green smiley, the 0, no pain. If you're at a hospital and you got the green smiley going, why are you here? Munchausen's? Go home. I'm sorry, I'll leave. But that is a very good framework for you to judge what your power level output is going to be. And I'm telling you, it's more accurate than you would think. The more accustomed and in tune you get with your body, the more you're paying attention, you are going to get pretty much the training stimulus and the response that you want by using perceived exertion. Now, I understand that there's going to be things that affect RPE. If you're ill, if you're tired, things are going to feel harder than they actually are per your effort. Or if you've had caffeine, or you're listening to a great song, or you're amped up for a race, maybe your RPE feels a little bit lower. But on balance, it's just a regular cycling routine. You can use this data, this RPE scale, in conjunction with your heart rate as a nice sense check to make sure that things are kind of matching up and it makes sense to you, to get a really solid training base. And you can train RPE for a long time. You don't need a power meter. Yes, it helps and it's more precise, and it will give you better calorie reads and different readings in terms of your kilojoules, things that can help your data to have a little bit more integrity to it. But in terms of being stronger as an athlete and performing better, RPE is going to work just fine for you. Once again, I understand that there is a lot of information in here, and a lot of it can be very obtuse to those people who are not accustomed to it. This is just to familiarize you with this material. You are not going to memorize or understand all of this if this is your first time being exposed to it, but you can come back to this video, or as you continue to see these types of terms and these elements out in the real world as you're training, you'll remember, oh, I saw that. I understand that a little bit. You don't need to understand what aerobic decoupling is and be able to define it to know that seeing that upward tick in terms of your heart rate is normal, and as you get more fit, that should get less severe. So you should be able to use a lot of these foundations to make very effective decisions about your training and really understanding how your body is reacting to the training, because that's the most important part of being a better athlete, being able to understand your body, to be able to listen to it so that you can elicit the greatest amount of performance. But if you have any comments, questions, concerns, please leave them down below. I'll do my best to help you guys out more down there. If you want to check out that calorie video, I will leave it right here. If you want to check out the Workouts 101 video, if you haven't seen that one yet, I will link that right here. Subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.